Given October 9th, 2007, a BC Recordings copyrighted presentation by Stephan Hoeller entitled The Battle About God, Where Do Gnostics Stand?
The topic this evening is an unusual one, and certainly one to which I very seldom address myself, at least as a separate subject, and that is really the subject of God, and as we might even say at the present time, the battle about God, or the battle of God. You may have noticed when looking through the current literature that in recent months, probably the last 6 months or so, not much longer, there has been a proliferation of literature, and some of it of a fairly serious nature, that attacks the concept of the deity, and that is promoting, when all is said and done, pretty much a philosophy of kind of time-honored, good old-fashioned atheism. So just like there is the old-time religion, there is the old-time atheism. And among these, I think a particular distinction belongs to the book by Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great, which of course with his British wit is a takeoff on the noted Muslim exclamation, Allahu Akbar, God is great. So Christopher Hitchens came along and said, no, he's not great. But it is addressed not only to the Islamic deity, or it doesn't treat only of the Islamic deity, but really treats of deity in general, at least, and this is the crucial part, I think, of our entire discussion. It treats of the deity as envisioned in the mainstream and majority religious milieu in the West. That is in Europe, in America, in Australia, in New Zealand, and places like that. And I have looked through the literature, and I have a considerable liking for Christopher Hitchens, particularly because I think he's a very witty man, and he's also more than a little learned. You know, he is the, I think his principal claim to fame is that he is one of the editors of Vanity Fair magazine, but he also writes regularly for the Atlantic Monthly, and has written several books and all that sort of thing. He's a very, very individual, very independent thinker. In any event, I looked through his book. I also looked through another one that is a major book in the field by Richard Dawkins, which carries on primarily a scientifically oriented argumentation. And I must say that I have not found much in these books that could be considered new. What may be new, however, if the trend continues and if it gathers any kind of momentum, is, I think, a giving voice to an underlying dissatisfaction with the central core of Western religiosity, namely its God concept. Now, we have seen evidence of, let's say, dissatisfaction with various aspects of the religious tradition of the West, Judeo-Christian or otherwise, in this case Islamic too. We have seen now for a number of decades a dissatisfaction with what some feel, with greater or lesser justification depending on the case, on one-sided and excessive masculine emphasis in Western religiosity and Western spirituality. That was one. We have found a dissatisfaction with the unwillingness of the religious circles to seriously look at the early history of the Christian faith and to address themselves perhaps seriously and with some degree of open-mindedness to the scriptures which have come to our attention over the last half a century or a little bit longer, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Library. The signs of this dissatisfaction have been evident to us in many ways, and probably one of the major explosions of an interest arising from that dissatisfaction having been a couple of years ago the almost unprecedented success of an otherwise really rather sleazy book, namely Dan Brown's Book of Renown. Let's just put it that way. Once again, when we subject that interest rather than the actual subject matter to an informed analysis, indicates that there is a profound distrust of the official and mainstream teachings of religiosity in the West, and that there is a considerable willingness to consider alternatives of various kinds. I don't need to tell you that for an even longer period there has been a tremendous change in the ultimately religiously motivated rules of behavior and mores of the West, resulting in all sorts of things. Certainly it would have been very hard to imagine even, 25, 30 years ago, that previously so greatly religious countries as, for instance, Spain, other European countries would have legalized same-sex marriages, and many other changes in the common mores of society. All of this indicating that there has been a diminishment of respect for many aspects of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that from many different angles, as it were, many different trajectories, the mainstream manifestations of the Judeo-Christian tradition are under assault. This is not quite as evident in the United States as it is in many other countries of Western culture, because the religious circles have indeed, if anything, gained in power, in the intensity of their convictions, and sort of the psychological point of gravity, we might say, has shifted in the United States from what for a long time have been the established mainstream denominations such as Roman Catholicism, Methodism, Presbyterianism and Episcopalianism, and has shifted to denominations which either weren't even around a few years ago, at least not by their present names, or at least were very much of the marginal variety not very long ago. Most of these denominations call themselves fundamentalist or at least evangelical. The fundamentals of religion in their eyes being, of course, primarily the preachments of the Bible and the various traditional interpretations attached thereto for a long period of time. And ever since that time, which would be sort of probably the 1920s or thereabouts, right around the end of World War I, let's say, the fundamentalist orientation has been growing in this country. and it probably has reached its most powerful expression within the last few years. So, as in so many other areas in our lives, in the culture, the world of religion, or as some people who don't like the term religion like to call it spirituality, and you hear these kinds of inane expressions very often, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, well, what do you really mean? In some cases, it may mean something fairly understandable by that, in other cases not. But there has been a polarization which has put the evangelical, which just simply means based on the gospel, Bible, literalist and fundamentalist element on one side, and what often is called a secular or secularized element on the other. And so we have a sharply divided scene in that regard in this country, where it would seem that at least for the time being, in Europe that is not the case, because religion has entirely lost, at least right now, its grip on the overwhelming majority of the people. So while Europe is almost entirely secular, the United States is only in part secular. Yet, with all of that and with all of these developments, it took this long for the critics, let's say, of religion and also of mainstream religion to direct their criticism and their ire at the very center of all religiosity, at least in the West, namely the Godhead itself. So it's not the moral system, not the commandments, it's not this, that, and the other thing that is under assault. Now God is under assault. And really the tale that hangs by that issue may be illustrated by a funny story that some of you have probably heard, and some of you may have even heard it from me, but it's worth repeating. I heard it from Joseph Campbell. Mr. Campbell was standing on a street corner in New York some evening. He was very insistent to describe it. He was wearing his tuxedo, he was going somewhere, and waiting for a taxi. And as he stood there, a youthful person, I believe belonging to the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's church, a Moonie as they are affectionately called, came up and started a conversation with him. And the conversation went something like this. Mister, do you believe in God? Campbell looked at him and he said very seriously, oh, son, I believe in many gods. Oh, I believe in many gods. Which, of course, as a scholar of mythology, and so he could say with considerable truthfulness. The Moonie was obviously somewhat taken aback by this answer. And so he tried to break through this barrier that Campbell had erected. And he said, well, yes, mister, but what about the God, the God of the Bible, the God of our fathers, the God of the Old and New Testament? And Campbell looked at him and seriously said, oh, yes, that one. Oh, yes, I believe in him too. And just by that time, the taxi came along, and Mr. Campbell jumped into the taxi, waved at the Moonie, and that was the end of the conversation. Now, you see, this may sound just like a nice, funny story, and it is. But it is also something else. There is a profound element here, because what so seldom seems to come to the fore in these disputes, including the most recent ones, is very much like what Campbell was alluding to. Which God? You see, which God? And the general assumption is always there. Obviously, it's quite understandable. After, at least in most of our countries, not in the United States. Maybe that's why the religious constellation is a little different here, because it lags behind the history of Europe, you know, obviously, newer country. But it is generally assumed in all of the various countries of Western civilization that God means the specific monotheistic God which we have inherited from Judaism, or let's say which both Christianity and Islam have inherited from Judaism and then modified to some degree and extent, and that a God concept or a God image, as for instance Jungian psychologists call it, means this one singular God image and no other. Now I contend, and if so many of you hadn't come, and if I would be ready to cut this very short, I could almost sort of quit right now, or we could all adjourn to a friendly neighborhood bar. I think there is one or two down the road, except for us, for the AAA folk, or is it AA folk, who maybe would adjourn to something else. But let's say, because it is my contention that this is really the crucial issue, and this is where I think, at least on the part of people of a more universal and more profound thought and orientation, have a job to do at the present time, and that is to begin to look at the possibility that the particular and specific God image, God concept, which existed and still exists in our culture, may be at fault, rather than the universal notion of some kind of consciousness or being or transcendental existence, which may be regarded as the fountain and origin of our world and also of ourselves, which may have characteristics and features very, very different from the God concept and the God image that we are used to. And that therefore it is not the, let's say, the universal and generic possibility of a God that is at issue, but monotheistic Godhead of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as it exists in the world today. Now, very few people, I think, in our culture are aware of the fact that, let's say, the monotheistic deity that appears in the Old Testament and that then, as I say, has been adopted and somewhat modified in Christian theology and in Islamic theology, that this deity was subject to doubt and criticism of a major nature quite a long time ago, namely right about at the time of the beginning of the Christian era. And indeed it would seem, although we have less precise information about that, for perhaps a few hundred years prior to the Christian era in Judaism itself. And this criticism, of course, eventually manifested in the position of the Gnostic tradition and appears very openly in the various Gnostic scriptures, but possibly, at least in part, originated already in the circles of Judaism which for some time prior to the beginning of the Christian era were exposed to religious and philosophical currents of a diverse nature in the Middle East, primarily coming from Greece, people who were conversant with Plato, people who were conversant with some of the Egyptian mysteries, the higher teachings of Assyro-Babylonian culture and so forth. And these people, in Judaism, they usually refer to them as minim, which means heretics. And there were various levels of heretics, as they always are. You know, the Samaritans, for instance, were one group at the time who didn't want to worship in the temple. The Essenes, whose scriptures, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have become acquainted with, were another. And many of these people felt that there was something wrong, not just with, the commandments and all the minute, picky interpretation of Jewish law about diet and about circumcision and this, that, and the other thing, but who were critical of the Old Testament deity itself. And who said that this does not appear to be a very respectable and commendable entity. In fact, I would hazard a guess, the Old Testament God became more and more of an embarrassment to the learned and cultured Jews of the Hellenistic era, and remained as such for a good many members of that Jewish heresy that ultimately came to be called Christianity. Because that's what it was. And so a serious problem arose. Something seems to be wrong with this God, you know. To say the least, is a person of a bad character. If any good Jew or good Christian, if there is still one of them left somewhere, you know, would behave the way that God behaves in the Old Testament, well, to say the least, he would be excommunicated and more likely would be turned over to the police. So this does not seem to be a good situation. That is how a lot of people felt, and then they were seeking ways of explaining this situation and of perhaps gaining a vision where they wouldn't have to cope with these terrible contradictions. Now, to this day, Jewish theology holds that God has, so to say, two sides. I mean, I don't mean physically, but two tendencies. And what are they? Good and bad. So God has a good side, God has a bad side. The nice things that happen to us come from his good side. The nasty things that happen come from his bad side. And you know, Christopher Hitchens and the other writers at the present time, Hitchens has several entries about Gnosticism in his book, and others, but still they pay minimal attention to the undeniable historical fact that there were definitely some very powerful alternatives to the established Judeo-Christian God concept and God image. And so let's go a little bit further, and let's say then along came these people, Jewish heretics and ultimately Christians also, who said, well, how might it be if this deity that appears in the Old Testament is not really the ultimate deity? That there may be something beyond this deity. Of course, we find the protestations of the Old Testament God that I am the only God and there are no other gods beyond me and all that sort of thing, and also the fierce condemnation of all other deities of other people around, you know. In fact, very few people talk about that, but if you want the real reason, historically, why, let's say, Judaism and subsequently Christianity were so misogynistic, had such a poor relationship to the feminine. It was because of the attitude of their God toward the other deities around, a good many of whom, not all, but a good many of whom were goddesses. So that's where it really all originates. It's an ethnic and a national hatred and defensiveness rather than anything else. Now, here, of course, now we have to enter a little bit on other realm, which may be a little more difficult conceptually to deal with or to accept than what I had so far. And that is this, that among these people, originally Jews, but then also others afterwards, there were those who had capacities, powers, whatever you want to call it, of prophetic and transcendental insight. After all, Judaism is the prime prophetic religion. It was full of prophets. And while, say, Zoroastrianism had only one prophet, and then Islam had only one prophet, the seal of, although Muhammad referred to many earlier prophets, even Jesus is a prophet, but this is a prophetic tradition. And in that prophetic tradition there were, well, let's say prophetic people who did not necessarily follow the pre-established pattern of "Thus saith the Lord," referring to this Old Testament deity, but who, let's say, communed with, so they felt, with transcendental powers, and who saw and conversed with angels. There was a big thing among the Essenes, for instance. These people had a whole elaborate system of angel magic, and they probably moved to the shore of the Dead Sea specifically because it was believed that it was a good place to do magic. Angel magic particularly. So these people communed with angels, they engaged in celestial flights, that's probably where the Kabbalah came from the Merkava, from riding on the chariot and so forth, and who, let's say, felt, well, we are able, if we sufficiently alter our consciousness, to carry on investigations of our own. And then they would get together and compare notes. Well, what did you find? Well, what did you find? What did you find? In this note-comparing situation, they came up pretty much with a kind of a consensus that, this being who appears in the Old Testament, yes, it was a powerful being, and it created, made, manufactured, crafted a good deal of this world, but it is not the ultimate deity. There is someone or something beyond it. And so what needs to be done with this deity is not just to say that it's false and it's evil or there's some kind of a demon, but it has to be placed in context, into a position of context to other powers and to other beings. And the way they did that was that they said, in the beginning of the beginnings, long before even anything physical came into existence, there was a fullness of consciousness, a plenum. And this fullness of transcendental consciousness, which is not, for all intents and purposes, personal, but Impersonal is probably not a very good word. We don't like anything impersonal because it's sort of cold and nasty and unresponsive and things like that, you know. But transpersonal, that was a good word invented, I think, if it was indeed invented in recent decades. But yet, let's say, having the capacity to manifest in a personal manner when that appears to be indicated. You see, here let's say these original old insights, these Gnostic insights, differ from, let's say, a lot of the contemporary kind of secularized spirituality. I mean, so it won't really work for you either. Is it not more likely that this beingness, when it chooses, can manifest as a person? Who are we to decree that God cannot be a person if he wants to be a person? Have to have fun in life too. But in any event, you know, similarly, I think that gentleman, the former Catholic priest, was shaking his head. So what these people came up with, and these were, I firmly believe, not only the original Gnostics, but they were the original Kabbalists as well, because it comes from the same source. And what they then said was that this process of world happening did not occur by way of a sudden creation out of nothing, as some of the theologians put it, but rather that this original being sort of emanated, poured itself forth, exuded itself, and entered the other regions until eventually the portions of itself which had gone the farthest away from the source became less and less like the source from whence they originated. It's not such an unreasonable idea, you know. It happens to every body of water that comes in, let's say, in a nice pristine form out of the mountains, out of the glaciers, or out of some wells or something, and then flows and flows through the countryside and picks up more and more pollution, and eventually ends up really a rather different thing from what it was when it started. So you see, something like this. Now, what are these last emanations which have become polluted, which have become polluted particularly in consciousness, to such an extent that they have become forgetful of who and what they are, of where they are coming from, and where they might be going? They're in total confusion and ignorance. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, folk, that they said those portions are you and you and you, and I'm sorry to admit even I. And not only us, but in another manner and other way, pretty much everything in this earthly creation. It is so far away from the source that its connection with the source now is very tenuous, although some elements are still there. And in between that ultimate source of the all, that ultimate consciousness, that fullness, which was often referred to then in Greek as the aletes theos, the true God, the true God, and the earthly manifestation here, in between that, there is a being who itself or himself has only a dim consciousness of what he is and where he may come from. He's not much smarter than we are, except more powerful in the sense that he's able to put together physical things and so forth. And they found a cognate term, which was used by Plato, and Plato, everybody followed Plato. Plato was the one-man canon of philosophy and of truth, never referred to in other way for long, long time as the divine Plato. You know? So Plato said that there is a what he called the demiurgos in Greek. That means a half-maker. I will not try to draw parallels to vernacular expressions that resemble that. But let's say, and it's called a half-maker because the substance, the underlying reality, the light that is hidden in the darkness, that part he did not make. That came from elsewhere when he came. But he made the forms. So half of the reality within which we live, which is the form reality, the material reality, the lesser reality, that he made. The other part he did not. Therefore he is called the half-maker or the demiurgos. So they came to identify the Old Testament deity with that demiurge. However, as let's say these heresies became more numerous and also more sophisticated, it came to be admitted quite often that, for instance, the Old Testament is only in part the message, the revelation of this demiurge. In fact, I think the Valentinian said that the Old Testament has three origins. One is the demiurge. The second is a little bit of material that filters through from the highest, from the true God, and you can find that in many of the Psalms. You can find them in the wisdom literature, such as the Wisdom of Solomon, you know, Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, and others. And then some are teachings of the elders of Israel throughout the ages. But certainly the vengeful, the cruel, the oppressive, the unyielding statements in the Old Testament come from this imperfect, intermediate, lesser deity. Now, I know and you know that even though we might look at this sort of thing with a somewhat open mind, yet in the back of our minds there is a tremendous resistance against it. And that is primarily because we carry the monotheistic obsession in our very genes in this culture in the West, you know. A Hindu would have no problem with it. He said, oh yes, that's maybe it's in our pantheon, maybe it's Prajapati, maybe it's, you know, various others. Oh yeah, that's quite possible, because the multi-centeredness of the God image is part of the polytheistic picture. You know. But for us, that is the idea that there might be two gods is just awful. It's just, I don't know why, but it's just awful. It's just awful. We can't cope with it. It's crazy making. But what we need to keep in mind is that what these people meant was really a supernatural yet imperfect being. More like an angel, you know. You don't have to imagine an all-wise, all-good, omnipotent, omni-this, omni-that kind of a being in this regard, but a being that is somewhat limited in consciousness even, limited in understanding, limited in character. Now, all right, here is the, and of course there are all, you might say, all the offices, that the roles that this Old Testament deity comes to play. Okay, it's creator. his creator. Now, right then and there, a person with powers of perception and judgment could come up with quite a bit of criticism. Why? Because look at this so-called creation. Oh yes, it hangs together reasonably well, you know, as when you kind of have the image of the Newtonian cosmos as kind of like a great big clockwork that keeps going. But within it there are very strange and very peculiar things. There is, first of all, in a mechanical sense, it works. The world, the cosmos, the earth, whatever you want to call it here. But in a moral and spiritual sense, it doesn't work. Because it's filled with injustice, it is filled with suffering, it is filled with death, it is filled with all kinds of really terrible and off-putting things for which there is no real moral justification. And about all the religious world of the monotheistic religious world can say is that, well, that's the way it is. You better accept it, not worry about it. Well, of course that's the way it is. We know that. But I think an intelligent person also occasionally asks a question that sounds more or less like, why? Why? You know? It's by no means unjustified. You know, we apply it to all kinds of things. Why should it be that way? Now, of course, along come the Easternizers who sort of pick and choose and take out of the other religions like Hinduism and Buddhism what suits their purposes usually, and never really the rest, and they say, oh, well, it's karma. You see, it's karma. And so they weave into this picture a situation wherein in the long run and over many lives and so forth, there is a kind of retributive system going on, which sometimes is based on the idea that I hit you over the head in this lifetime and you will hit me over the head in my next life. Then we are, for a short time, we are even, and then the balance will be upset again. Now, of course, I'm jesting a bit, but that's par for the course, at least so I think. Now, all right. Once again, the question arises, if indeed there is such a thing as karma, and if indeed it works the way various people feel that it does work, the question arises, why? Why? You know? And this, of course, is something that one should not approach, one should not question. But these peculiar people of old and throughout history, they did question it. And they said they would answer to the why by saying, the reason that these things are thus is because whatever consciousness put them together was not perfect either. These things were not designed and devised by a perfect God. They were designed by some kind of imperfect consciousness that moreover on top of it was not at all concerned with justice and not concerned with whether its creatures are suffering or not. Now, you know, I don't want to start out on my old route here, which is very enjoyable to me, but not so much to everybody else, as to what kind of, I don't mean just strange, I don't mean just unusual, but unbelievably and horribly bizarre things exist in this creation. And, you know, the imagination of an H.P. Lovecraft or a Stephen King is nothing compared to what goes on in this world. It goes on everywhere. It goes on the human level, goes on elsewhere. And if you look at where you would really not expect maybe something so horrible, look into the insect world. which has a greater variety of species and subspecies than any other kingdom of nature. And the things that go on in there and boggle the mind, you know. Incredible, grotesque, horrible things of creatures that come along and lay their eggs into the living substance of another creature, and the little ones happily hatch there and eat up while it is still alive the other creature and then go on their way. That's just one little manifestations, but there are many, many variations in the theme. As I say, Stephen King couldn't think of anything as horrible as what really goes on in this world. Now, all right, again, it's there. What are we going to do about it? Fortunately, we don't suffer that much from that, although we have our own sufferings. Or perhaps, have you ever been around where praying mantises are? You know, well, a couple of years ago there was quite a proliferation of them in northern Arizona, where I went to visit for a little while there, and the mantises were all over the place. And here I looked at a funny-looking mantis. It sort of looks bigger than the other. Well, it was the mantises mating, and the male's head was already eaten by the female. He didn't quite know it yet, and he still went on with his copulatory activities, but his head was not there. Now, I, of course, with my Hungarian sense of humor or whatever, you know, I said, oh, well, this is not the first or the last time that a man lost his head over a woman. But, you know, but, you know, really, all jest aside, I mean, these things are weird. If anybody designed this, it's not just intelligent design. It is devilishly cruel design. That's what it is. You see, that's what it is. Now, all of these and many other factors indicate that the traditional notion of a good and wise and just deity, having designed or created, I don't care which one we use, this material universe and ourselves in it, does not make any sense. But the possible notion that this is an intermediate being that we are dealing with here, and that there is something that is good. The Greeks called it the good. There is something that is wise. There is something that is true beyond this creation, and even perhaps its creator, or at least its half-creator. That, I think, makes a certain amount of sense. And so when we find all throughout history the mystics, those who communed with a benign and a good deity, and so forth, then we can be assured that they appear to have made contact with a reality of a superior nature. Not this flawed reality here, but the reality of a superior nature. When we come to that, then we begin to see that the problem is with the kind of God that our culture came to believe in. A God image that is extremely imperfect, that is either immoral or amoral, that is seemingly without compassion, and that therefore is, let's say, very questionable and very off-putting to an individual who has himself or herself intelligence, consciousness, an innate morality. He looks at all of these things and will consider them very, very unfortunate and very reprehensible. So who is the God whom Christopher Hitchens and others are attacking. It is that particular God image. It is not the true God of the mystics, but it is the imperfect designer and creator of the lesser worlds. This is how, at least this is how the ancient visionaries who communed with these things have put it. So the notion of denying the existence of consciousness in and beyond creation because of the imperfections of creation is not quite right either. To saying that there is nothing here or nothing beyond is, let's say, contrary to the, ultimately to the data of experience. Well, that is why it is foolishness to say that there is nothing there. If anything, there is too much there. There is all kinds of consciousness. There are all kinds of forces. And beyond these forces, there is something good. There is something true. There is something real. And there is an element, a fragment, a spark of that ultimate being, so these alternative mystical traditions say, in us. That is why we are able to conceive of it. That is why we are able to relate ourselves to it. That is why we are able to reach out toward it in prayer and meditation, in magic and in various ways, because deeply within us there is something that knows. Not just believes, but knows. See, this is the difference. That's why so much of what became conventional mainstream spirituality in our culture is based on belief. The euphemism for is faith. You know, if all of our politicians, oh yeah, I'm a man of faith, you know, or woman of faith, whatever the case may be, you know, and that faith is belief, you know. Well, belief is not the same as knowing. You can believe all kinds of things, and then you'll find out that they're not true. Right? But that there is a capacity within us to know, and that capacity exists because of a kinship in essence between the deepest self within ourselves and that ultimate consciousness from whence, according to the seers and the sages, we have come. And this creates an abiding, at least an abiding possibility of connection between us, bypassing even the powers of this demiurge who governs the world, shall we say. You know? It's interesting to note, for instance, you know, elements of this are present, especially in the New Testament, because it really takes, I think, very much of a brainwashed, either a brainwashed or a brainless person, not to perceive in the New Testament that the overall message of the New Testament and of the founder of the Christian religion, of Jesus, is very, very different from that Old Testament deity. Very, very different. Mercy, kindness, forgiveness, brotherhood and sisterhood, the underlying fraternity of the humans, these are the principles that are taught in the New Testament. There is no proof that the reference of Jesus to the Father is to the Old Testament deity. That is an assumption that was foisted on us, you know, later on. Oh, Father, he doesn't say my Father, it says the Father, you know. The indication is here, again, as it so often is in the visions of the saints and of people of great spiritual vision, that while there is a power here that is very judgmental, that is very unforgiving, that is very harsh, there is something that can come from beyond that power. And that the great messengers of light, including the last great one, Jesus Christ, are of that order. And they bring, we'll see, the Jewish term for it is mercy. The Buddhist term for it is compassion. But that is what they bring, and not the judgment. You know, he whom the judge was not written about the good messengers of light. Not at all. Now, let's just, inasmuch as our time moves along with us greatly, you know, this is the basic sketch. I think the answer to the anger and concern of the new atheists, as well as probably of the old atheists, is to come to recognize what kind of theos are we talking about here. Once again, I'm reminded of the really cute story that I encountered with my late landlord. My landlord owned this apartment house in Hollywood, an old Russian Jew, very nice old man. He died at almost the age of 100. And he knew that I was involved in religious matters and things like that. And then after he had some kind of sort of dangerous experiences, he came up to me one time. He said, say. He said, I'm an atheist. That's what he always. I'm an atheist. Oh, that's fine. I said, okay. He said, but tell me, what's going to happen to me after I die? What's going to happen to me after I die? So I said to him, well, look, Mr. So-and-so, let me just tell you what I think. I think that where you are going, they are not going to care whether you had been atheist or not. That's not going to figure in the equation at all. You were a good man. You did good things. You took care of your family, everything. Those things will be more important. Are you sure? Are you sure? Well, I'm reasonably sure. But you see, again, what was this man saying, as so many of them? I said, well, I'm an atheist, but at the same time, there is something else, right? The atheist because he couldn't believe in the God that was held up to him as the God, and therefore, in that sense, he was an atheist. So there is no reason, I think, for a person of consciousness and for a person who sincerely tries and perhaps also ultimately succeeds in intensifying and raising his or her consciousness to be a total denier of divinity. But it is incumbent upon such a person to recognize that much that passes in religion and elsewhere as God is not really God, but some kind of intermediate consciousness. Once again, I have no investment in personalizing these things. Many of them, of course, I mean, the one way to express visionary reality is in mythological form, because that's about the only way that you can do it. That's the only language that is halfway adequate to the kind of perceptions that the great seers have. That's why they don't come forth and talk about data and facts, you know. The seers and the sages, the prophets, the shamans are not computers, you know. They are not concerned with giving you concrete information. They are concerned with giving you intimations of a reality that is beyond this world. And that's not easy to do. That's why a lot of people have highly unusual, insightful experiences in this world. I've met a lot of them, and you know, they didn't talk about it, only under the most private circumstances. They were very shy about it and very careful about it, primarily because they said, you know, if I tell you about it, you're going to think I'm crazy. I said, you know what, I'm crazy too, so come on, you know, tell me. But that's why. It's so difficult to express, it's so difficult to make sense out of these greater experiences, that those who have done so almost inevitably put them in poetic, mythic form, And then the people who read that or to hear it recited derive their own intimations, their own flashes of insight, are stimulated to similar experience themselves. And so I think we can rest assured that if we try to do that, and if others try to do that, then we may discover, not all at once perhaps, and not in an overwhelming mysterium tremendum, as they put it in Latin, although sometimes that happens also, but in intimations that are like flashes of lightning, like the will-o'-the-wisp that moves over the countryside. We will begin to have intimations of an other reality that transcends earthly things, that transcends even the designer, and there we will find something that is true, there we will find something that is good, and something that is beautiful. Now, am I implying that there is nothing good and nothing true and nothing beautiful around here? Well, no, I'm not, and if I believed that, then I think I would have committed suicide long ago, because I wouldn't want to stay in a place like that, not even a minute. No, there is much here. It's a checkerboard. That's why the demiurge has been called the half-maker, you know, the very word that has coined, I think, by Plato, or at least used by Plato. And there is much here that is beautiful, and there is some here that is good. And there are nice and interesting stimuli all over the place. But as certain mystery schools have intimated when they made the tessellated pavement, which is like a checkerboard of their temples, black, white, good, bad. You see? That's the way it is here. But there is something else which is all good, where the bad is no longer there, where the flaw is no longer present. But when we can't make, and most people don't even have the opportunity to think about it, because this kind of idea, this kind of information never comes to them. If it comes to them with their monotheistic mind, they reject it. But if we can come to contemplate and maybe tentatively accept that, then we have an entirely different situations. And then we don't need Christopher Hitchens and others to attack. Because we know that things are dicey with this lower deity or this lower consciousness or whatever we wish to call it. But we have also come to learn by way of some of our experience that there is something really good and wise beyond, and that we can make contact with that. And that is what people have called salvation. And that is what people have called enlightenment, and by various and sundry names. Until that happens, and to those to whom this kind of recognition in some form, you know, I don't insist that this recognition has to come exactly in the form of the old Gnostics. After all, you know, I love the old boys and girls back there, and I'm affinitized to them, and I love their poetry, and I love their visions, and so forth. But, you know, I mean, there were 1600, 1700 years ago that they were around. A lot of things have changed, and people see things in a different way. But in some fashion, in some way, by whatever means, you know, come to that understanding, then we're so much better off. So if, for instance, you wonder why someone like Mother Teresa, the Albanian Christian woman who went to India and who gave her life and everything that she was and everything that she had for the poorest of the poor. I mean, really one of the most admirable people, I think, in the history of the world. And yet now there is somewhat overblown, I think, this hullabaloo about her journals, her letters, which in the course of her canonization process have been discovered and are being published. And then we have things like one of those great sources of wisdom and truth in our culture called Newsweek magazine. You know, it's sort of a part of the New Testament of America. The Old Testament is the Reader's Digest. You know? And so Newsweek magazine wants something written about Mother Teresa. Who do they ask to write about her? Christopher Hitchens. Well, this is, kind of difficult. It's like, I don't know, asking Lenin to write an article about the virtues of capitalism. It just doesn't really work. It doesn't really work. And so, of course, he wrote, all right, and he quoted and everything else, but here is a not only dyed in the wool, but a militant atheist. And that's whom you ask to write about somebody like Mother Teresa. But, even he has some good things to say. And here are some of the quotations that Hitchens had put from Mother Teresa in his article in September 10th issue of Newsweek magazine. Here are some of the things that she told her various advisors and wrote in her letters, he says. For me, the silence and the emptiness is so great that I look and do not see, listen and do not hear. The tongue moves but does not speak. Such deep longing for God and repulsed, empty, no faith, no love, no zeal. The saving of souls holds no attraction. Heaven means nothing. What do I labor for? If there be no God, there can be no soul. If there is no soul, then Jesus, you also are not true. And Christopher Hitchens comments, like an old-fashioned Morse signal, the cryptic and dot-dash punctuation somehow serves to emphasize and amplify her distress. Well, of course it's a complex issue that requires all sorts of trajectories to understand. But as other writers on the issue have pointed out, that perhaps one of the difficulties here also is the kind of God that she was trying to relate to. We don't really know. But it also needs to be remembered that in the spiritual life of great saints and of great souls, there are always periods of profound darkness and dejection, dark nights of the soul, and which seems to be, very largely just really part of the picture. But here also one wonders whether if this great and noble soul had had a little different God image, if she had not swallowed the dogma without any modification and without any question, if she had had a little intimation of the subtle differences that exist between what might appear to be the ultimate God and the true God itself, that she might not have suffered so, although we cannot really know. But I think we do know this much, that we live in strange and crucial times. Of course, every age is strange, and many ages are crucial, and it is always the best of times and always the worst of times. But one of the important characteristics of this period is that there is what the existentialists long ago used to refer to a transvaluation going on. And that transvaluation has to do, in this case, with the spiritual foundations of our culture, right down to God, right down to the image, to the concept of the reality of God. And if that transvaluation can proceed in a manner which is ultimately productive, then I think more and more people in our culture will be able to work their way through something greater, to something better, something more complete and more full and more universal. If, on the other hand, that does not happen, then I think we are in deep trouble. Because the substitutes that we individually devise for spirituality, I don't hesitate to use the word religion, are usually inadequate. Chesterton said, when people cease to believe in God, they don't believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything. So that really inferior products are likely to slip in and then create a great deal of havoc. So therefore, this is a time when gnosis, the knowing of the true divine, is no longer a luxury, but it is a necessity. It is a necessity. And if even a small number of people address themselves insightfully, wisely, tolerantly to that necessity, then a great deal can change for the better. Valentinus, the great Gnostic, said that if only one person achieves real gnosis, the flaw in the universe, the crack in the fabric of the world, is thereby to a considerable extent mended. And if there are more, then the mending is even better. So I don't think that we need to have a very dark view of the future. As long as there are some of us who address themselves to that, as long as there are some who strive for that gnosis and avail themselves of the stimuli that are present in the world, I think things can still get very much better. And the flaw and the suffering and the pain and the horror can diminish. And the light from beyond this world can begin to enter and to shine. And the dark vault which closes us off from the ultimate can be perforated more and more, like the ancients said that the stars are little holes in the ceiling, and the light enters from beyond. And as one poet has said, there is a crack in the universe. That's how the light gets in. May that crack get bigger. May that light become more abundant. And then all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Thank you very much.
Copyright MMBII by GC Recordings. For more information about the available lecture titles and for many other resources, visit gnosis.org. That's gnosis.org.